Hey everybody, we're back, and we figured we'd actually start the class. Um, I guess the way we'd go with the class discussions for Dungeons and Dragons, and how to get more narrative fulfillment out of just using people's classes as a narrative tool. Which I don't know if a lot of people do. People kind of generally divorce mechanism from narrative for the most part. So a class is just something on your character sheet. It's not something generally that people see as deeply important, with the exception, I think, a couple classes kind of automatically. But we're just going to go alphabetical. So what are we working with today?
Well, and there's also, of course, also the example where people are entirely their class and don't have a character. But the what we're talking about today will be, as you said, alphabetically. We will be starting with the barbarian. Now, what is a barbarian? What do we mean when we say barbarian, and where does the word even come from? Well, originally there was an ancient Greek word, and I'm probably not going to get this right, but barbaros, I think, and that's where the word barbarian comes from, and it meant babbler, aka someone who doesn't speak Greek. And later, the Romans, when they obtained power, they widened the definition of this word to mean those without Greco-Roman culture. The Greek and the Romans sort of blended together a lot, but they looked down upon other groups outside of their own. And barbarian became a label placed upon other cultures, tribes, or peoples that were seen as being of lower standing and of lacking civilization. And our modern day definitions, as taken from Merriam-Webster, would be one, a person from an alien land, culture, or group believed to be inferior, uncivilized, or violent, used chiefly in historical reference. And two, a barbarous person, a rude, crude, uneducated, or uncivilized person. That is our definitions.
Yeah, and for right now, if we just take it in narrative context, I think what's very important for a barbarian to get I guess the full mileage out of it is that a character who is barbarian, at their core, the principle that we're dealing with is the other. Something that is vastly different from what you have, and generally that also means different to whatever society that you're in. So I think if you want just the built-in narrative benefit of having a barbarian in the party, you really want to have times where it focuses on that difference. Both player and DM can do that. From scene to scene, you can have them focus on, like, okay, this is something that was not in their society. You can go as simple as the tropes of not knowing how to deal with people, but it can go a little bit deeper of not knowing cultural importance and
I think what we're getting here is that a barbarian does, by definition, not call themselves a barbarian. They are
mm-hmm.
barbarian in relation to some other group
Yeah.
that calls them that,
If
because
anything,
they
it's
are
a derogatory term.
yeah,
It's used to deride. They would not use it themselves.
yeah,
Now that can be different in your setting for whatever
yes,
you
of
would
course
like,
it's
but that is at least the concept that should evoke in your mind is that you would not call a barbarian to his face.
yeah, because they and this also see since a barbarian is a barbarian in relation to some other culture or some other norm or such that is well considered a norm or the commonplace in the whatever region or part of the world that you are currently dealing with. You can ask yourself a few other questions as well about them, as when it comes to their group or tribe or whatever origin they may have. It could be nomadic, could be a lot of things, but what is this culture or group's relationship to these more civilized, or
hmm
those who call themselves civilized? Are they indifferent? Are they just whatever, they go on with whatever, they do their stuff, we're fine with our stuff?
hmm
Are they opposed to it? Do they think that society and civilization weakens people or something along those lines? Or
Yeah, their culture
there
and
are many.
value system.
Yes. And
Uh,
there's also, of course, the possibility that your character as an individual is actually technically part of a more civilized culture, but you are standing opposed to to your society's cultural values, and as such, you are comparatively a barbarian.
Yeah, that's always an angle that I really like, is that you are, as opposed to a berserker, you're a
Yeah,
berserker, like the common trope of berserker. That's always like, because I think one of the things that sets barbarian apart is really it's embodied in the mechanism of rage in 5e. A lot of other systems use it as well, but we primarily talk about 5e.
yeah,
So that rage mechanic, figuring out that rage mechanic, how it manifests for your character, and why it manifests for your character. Is it supernatural? Is it something from within? Or is it just literally physical prowess of some kind? And that
yeah,
you can, backwards rationalize rage to be just about anything. Make it
yeah,
interesting for you. And that's one of the great things about 5e mechanisms, is they're not so crunchy that it's really just a couple lines of text and you for yourself can figure out why it does that.
yeah. Just like you can take the stat block of a sword and call it a saber,
Hmm.
you can take the mechanic called rage and say that this is the force of your ancestors entering your blood, or your totemic spirits. Or I had an idea once for a warforged barbarian who literally had like a handle with a ripcord that he would pull
Nice.
to rev himself up like a chainsaw.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Or something.
And
That, of course, that's the kind of thing that works in a less serious game. But like,
mhm.
you can really make it almost anything. It could literally just be an adrenaline rush, and your character is basically just like mosh pits
Yeah.
at concerts and such.
And I've had it to where the character that I was playing puts themselves into the hunter state, where it is the hunter's eye, and when they do this, everything kind of from their perception slows down. They get that the prey and predator sense, to where that's what rage is for them. It's the idea of the hunt. Instead of it being just a sheer force of strength. So they're able to, because everything is a little easier for them to take in, glancing blows and things like that. It's not their physical prowess.
Yes, yeah. So you can recolor, rescheme, retheme this mechanic in many, many, many ways, and that fact also ties into to further questions about what your barbarian culture or such values and such. You could be the spirits, it could be uh, ancestors, it could be that you simply have a cultural value of endurance and strength, that you refuse to show yourself as weak, and that
Hmm.
you have embodied this fact. Or there could be many other elements, and these in turn can tie into the world and how they relate to the civilized culture or such. That is your culture more of an honor bound culture? Is it more about traditions? Is it more about ancestry? There are so many potential ways you could go with it.
Yeah. Another thing when you're talking about, if you talk about a character's backstory or an NPC's backstory, if you come from one of these barbarian tribes, they may not all fit the barbarian archetype in regards to raging weapons and things like that. I always like the druidic shaman, who is kind of like the spiritual leader of a quote unquote barbarian tribe. There's, fighters are probably among them, where they're martially trained. They don't just rush in there into combat. You can, warlocks. You could make the idea that these barbarian tribes are more than just kind of mindless berserkers. That
Yeah,
that there are a few in there that have, either through training or spiritual means, have turned rage into a weapon. But
yeah,
it can be a little bit more sophisticated than that, and that can make, especially if you want to, like bring a PC, if the narrative brings them back to the barbarians tribe. So now we have a complete inverse of the narrative. Now the rest of the party is the other, and that can be really interesting for the characters, especially if you've gone a long time in your campaign, maybe 10, 12 sessions, or more even, and the barbarian has been the other always, and it's kind of been a point of either contention or humor we flip this on this head, and now all these other characters are having to deal with that, and seeing that there's actually a lot more sophistication to these people than they would have originally taken for, and that they have a certain deep wisdom about the naturalistic world, that they're not just savages.
And there could be all kinds of interesting interactions where your civilized characters perform some form of taboo that they had no understanding of.
Yeah, and
And
it
so
can be,
the barbarian has to explain why you are never the first one to step over the entrance of the hut because
yeah.
this or that.
Yeah, and it can be as, swingy and weird as you want it to be, where it's like the supernatural thing, or it comes from cultural relevance. Only the strongest passes through, because if there's some sort of attack or ambush, the strongest is the one. It's for him to take that. So if you step before the chief, you're saying that you're more powerful than the chief, something like that. So it can be,
Yeah, yeah.
it can
And
be actually pragmatism.
yeah, and like in certain dojos of martial arts training and such, there is the principle that the higher the skill level, the further away from the entry door you are, so that if there was an attack, it's the least valued fighter that will go down first, and the ones who are more capable will be the ones to be able to stand up and fight back because
Yep.
they've had time to arm themselves.
Yeah, and you can do either or something in between. I like the idea that in both ways, it's like, oh, we must protect our most powerful, or have our most powerful be able to retaliate, but
Yeah.
also the most powerful, in maybe a different culture, considering themselves so powerful that it's like, no, nothing can take me down, and if you think you're more powerful than me, then we need to have a discussion.
Yeah, and the important part here is that there is a logic behind these kinds of cultural decisions and ways to organize things that are based on an idea of what this culture values. If the culture values endurance, then things that make stuff easy might be frowned upon because you're not showing that you can endure.
Yeah, and
If you
even
have a
yeah, and even if your campaign never goes and reaches these barbarian tribes, it can be very useful for players and DMs, even together, to write all these cultural traditions that the barbarian has, because that will then feed into what that character and what the player acts like that character in session, and can give more depth to playing that character. And that's really what the point of this entire series is to give more depth by just looking at one small variable. We're not even talking about weapons of use, places of travel, what subclass you pick, none of this stuff. We're just taking one variable and saying you can pull 20 pages of narrative structure out of just the class.
Yes, there is so much we can do with so little, and so often we take so many different details, and then we add something onto that isn't always necessarily congruent with the other part, or necessarily doing the most with them.
Yeah. I very much have a personal ethos that you don't need a large amount of options and choices and all these mechanical knobs to be twisting to have an interesting character. A human barbarian is as interesting as you make it, just like a kobold paladin is as interesting as you make it. There's no inherent interest in it.
Yeah, a generic story well told is still better than an absurd or original story poorly told. It's
Yep.
more about what you do with it than it is about how unique or special or specific or non-generic you want to make something.
Yep. Do you have anything else to close our barbarian video on?
Just the fact that, like, you can, for an example to compare, you can think of something like certain barbarian tribes and cultures have more of a focus on honor, and then suddenly they will go up to whatever city or such that they intend to fight and be like, we are going to raid you in this many days, and then because these barbarians, they want to fight, they want the enemy to know that this is coming, and this will be an honorable interaction. And then you have the stereotypical orcish barbarian tribe who is less interested in might be less interested in honor and more interested in just sheer bloodshed.
Mm-hmm.
And then doing a surprise attack is in no way incongruous with their code of ethics or approach or their principles. There is so many ways you can play it, and it's easy to fall back on the generic, and the generic isn't bad,
Mm-mm.
but it's easy to find other ideas if you just give it that extra second of thought.
Not to mention, that generic can be very powerful if you introduce it early in a campaign and you have it juxtaposed with something. So if you have
Yes.
that the party or the city is dealing with these chaotic barbarians on a constant basis, but they have to deal with maybe the character in the party who is a barbarian, he comes from a much more lawful, dutiful, and honorful tribe. And so the city has to deal with, or rather, the player has to deal with the fact that he is perceived as one of these savages. And he's, no, these are different. We're not all the same just because we're from, the wildlands.
I'm not of that tribe. Can't you see the difference in my facial tattoo?
Exactly. And
Players are on the other side.
yeah, and sometimes those juxtapositions can be enough of a narrative pull to really get you quite a few miles in different sessions.
Yes.
That's the important part, is that if you're going to use
Yeah.
something generic, make it good, write it well, and then use juxtaposition when
Yeah,
when you feel.
and no group of culture is monolithic. There are exceptions, and there are different groups and tribes you can do all kinds of dynamics with.
Yep, and if you get even more noodly, even within it, it's not monolithic. There are differences in
Yeah,
opinions, and over time, values can shift a little bit on the line as different leaders come into power.
yeah.
But I think that's all I have. What you got? Are your barbarian rages sated?
I believe so. I believe so. We've provided plenty of options here. And again, this is lots and lots of options that you can do what you want with.
Yep.
Nothing is absolute. There are so many things, many noodly bits that you can get into detail, or you can make something relatively simple and let it grow as you play. There's so many approaches you can have, and don't feel like you have to tick every box of every question we have here, but consider the question and then see what makes sense.
Yep. My charge to you, and it's going to be the same with all of these videos, is that give me your class ideas. Barbarians that you either played that you thought were a lot of fun, or concepts that you think are interesting that use the barbarian trope maybe a little differently, or ones that fit right into that stereotype that you just had a blast with, because it might help other people and get ideas for their barbarians. And another goal to this is to get you to play classes that you thought were boring, because a lot of people think fighters are boring, but once we get to that one, you're going to see that they're not. But barbarians are a super interesting class, so give them a try, and you can bring a lot of narrative clout with these ragey boys. All right, we'll see you on the next one.